first sound is laughter. It drifts across the mudflats of the Sajo River, careless and bright, tangled with the wet moans of men who won't see nightfall. Then the smell arrives. Iron and rot, rising with the April sun off 70,000 butchered bodies and their horses. The finest knights of Christendom lie stacked in the mire, their boiled leather armor hacked open, their heads gone. That morning, they rode out as the fist of God, wrapped in steel and certainty. Now they are food for the crows. This was not a battle. This was the calm dismantling of a civilization on the plains of Mohi. The world had ended, and the men who ended it were laughing. Through the wreckage, a king runs, not a hero rallying survivors, a frightened man in torn silk, his breath ripping out of him in sobs. This is King Béla IV of Hungary. His crown, once proof of God's favor, is now just metal that could get him killed. Mongol scouts hunt him across his own burning kingdom. Every snapped branch is a rider closing in. Every smudge of smoke on the horizon is another city wiped off the map. He crawls through swamp and forest like a hunted animal. One thought left in him: run. He runs toward the sea, the last hope of anything cornered. So how does a broken man, a king who watched his army and his people ground into ash, become the architect of the Mongol Empire's worst humiliation? Strip a ruler of everything but his fear, and something new takes shape. In the cold of that flight, a hard idea sets in his mind. He finally sees the thing hunting him. You cannot fight a horde that feeds on open plains and soft cities. You have to starve it. You have to build a trap the size of a country. To save his kingdom, he would first have to turn it into a tomb. Tell us which city and country you're watching from in the comments below. And if you believe these stories deserve to be told, take 1 second to subscribe and support this work. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. Kiev, December 1237. The golden domes still catch the low winter sun. For 3 centuries, this was the mother of the Russ's cities. Prince Yaroslav the Wise had raised its great cathedral over the grave of his father. Hundreds of churches, markets that traded amber from the Baltic and silk from Byzantium. 50,000 souls behind walls, the princes of Europe called unbreakable. To the men riding out of the east, it was none of that. It was firewood. The horde closed around it like water filling a bowl. Fur and iron under a sky the color of iron. The Ipatiev Chronicle records that the creak of Mongol ox carts, the bellowing of the camels, and the noise of the men drowned out voices inside the city. A person could not hear his neighbor speak. And with them came something Europe had never faced. Chinese and Persian engineers, siege machines wound with torsion cables, built to throw stones the size of oxen, clay pots of burning naphtha, and the corpses of the plague dead over the walls. The command fell to Munka, grandson of Genghis, and to Batu Khan, whose banner flew over the whole Western campaign. They first sent envoys to demand 1/10 of everything, 1/10 of the men, the horses, the coin. The Kievan Prince Michael had those envoys killed and fled to Hungary. There would be no second offer. The Mongols set their engines against the Polish gate, where the wall was weakest, and pounded it day and night without pause. The Ipatiev scribe wrote that the walls shook under the stones, and the townspeople could not hear one another for the din. When the gate finally broke, the people of Kiev fought house by house, street by street. They fell back to the Church of the Tithes, the oldest stone church in the land, and packed onto its upper gallery with what they could carry. So many climbed in that the walls gave way under the weight and the roof came down on them all. They understood what the invaders wanted. Not tribute, not surrender, extinction. The killing had no end and no exception. The Mongols stacked the skulls of the dead into pyramids outside the gates. 6 years later, a Franciscan named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine crossed the same ground on his way to the Khan's court. He wrote that the earth was littered with countless skulls and bones of the dead, and that of a great city he could count barely 200 houses standing, their people held in slavery. This was the machine now turning toward Hungary. It did not conquer. It emptied. It left behind silence and white bone. Krakow burned. Wrocław burned. On April 9, 1241, 2 days before the trap on the Sajo, a Polish and German army under Duke Henry the Pious was cut to pieces at Legnica. The Mongols cut one ear from every dead man on that field and filled 9 sacks. Henry's head was struck off and carried on a spear to the walls of the town so his own people would look at it. His mother, Saint Hedwig, later found his body on the field only by the 6 toes on his left foot. The news traveled ahead of the horde on the backs of refugees whose stories sounded like the ravings of the mad. But there was no madness in it, only method, and the method was riding straight for King Béla IV. The man who designed the storm was named Subutai. Not a warlord, not a prince. The son of a blacksmith from the Uriankai, a forest people who herded reindeer. He had ridden with Genghis Khan himself from the beginning. He had chased the last Khwarezmian Shah to a lonely island in the Caspian, where the man died in rags. He had ridden clear around that sea and broken a Rus and Cuman army at the Kalka River in 1223, then laid heavy boards over the bound bodies of the captured princes and feasted on top of them while they slowly suffocated underneath. By 1241 he was past 60, heavy, half-crippled by gout and old wounds. He had lost an eye. He could no longer sit a horse. His men carried him into battle in a covered cart, and from inside that cart his mind worked like cut stone. He did not see kingdoms on a map. He saw weakness. He studied his enemies the way a hunter studies the habits of a deer. He sent spies west years ahead, merchants, monks, men who counted roads and rivers and asked idle questions in market squares. He knew which passes through the Carpathians a wagon could cross before he ever saw them. He had Batu send Béla a letter demanding surrender, and Béla did not answer. That silence was all Subutai needed. He knew the knights of Europe worshipped glory. He knew their whole way of war rested on one thing: the heavy cavalry charge, thousands of men and horses in armor crashing forward in a single thunderous moment. He knew they thought retreat was a stain worse than death, so he built his campaigns around those beliefs. He turned their virtues into a noose. His favorite weapon was the false retreat. He would send a handful of horse archers to sting the enemy line, loose a few arrows, then wheel and flee. To a European commander, it looked like a broken foe running for its life. It looked like easy fame. So they charged. Heavy knights broke ranks and gave chase, hearts pounding with the hunt, riding for miles until their horses blew and their formation stretched thin as thread. Then the ground came alive. From ridges, from tree lines, from behind low hills, the main army rose and folded in on both flanks. The hunters were now the hunted, packed into a killing box built exactly for them. Subutai did not beat armies. He talked them into destroying themselves. He held their pride like a leash and walked them off a cliff. Now that leash was in his hand, and Hungary was on the other end of it. There is one more thing worth knowing about the man he was hunting. Béla had made his own kingdom brittle before the Mongols ever arrived. He had spent his early reign clawing back crown lands that earlier kings had given away to the great lords, and the great lords had not forgiven him for it. He even ordered their chairs removed from his audience hall so they would stand while he sat. When he needed them most, many of them remembered the grudge. In the winter of 1239, a Cuman king named Kotoni had crossed the Carpathians with 40,000 of his people, fleeing the same horde. Béla took them in. He hoped to add their horse archers to his army, the one kind of soldier who could actually answer the Mongols on their own terms. He even stood godfather at Kotoni's baptism. But the Hungarian nobles hated the newcomers. The Cumans were pagans, herdsmen, strangers who let their cattle trample sown fields. Rumors spread that they were Mongol spies. In the days before the battle, a mob in Pest dragged Kotoni and his household from their lodging and threw their heads out a window into the street. The Cumans answered by burning their way south out of the kingdom, killing as they went. Béla lost 40,000 of the only warriors who understood the enemy, and he lost them a week before he needed them most. He rode to the Sajo, already bleeding. In the spring of 1241, the Hungarian host gathered on the west bank of the river. 65,000 men, maybe more. At its core stood thousands of armored knights, the pride of Central Europe. Beside them rode the Templars in white mantles under their master, and crusaders drawn from across the continent by the Pope's call to hold the line against the pagan East. Béla's own brother, Cuman, king of the southern lands, rode with him. So did the two archbishops of the realm, in mail over their vestments. Béla surveyed the camp and felt the weight of it as strength. A wide plain at his back, the river as a shield. His wagons chained rim to rim into a wooden fortress, a lager bristling with iron and hide. Only one stone bridge crossed the Sajo, and he had packed it with guards. The Mongols would have to come across it, into his arrows, into his teeth. He felt safe. He felt strong. He was already a dead man. The wagon fort itself was the trap closing on its own defenders. Chained together, the carts left almost no room to move inside. Men and horses stood packed shoulder to flank in the dark. Rope tied wheel to wheel. A ditch to keep the enemy out is also a wall to keep the panic in. Across the water, hidden in the trees, Subutai looked at the same plain from his cart and saw a stockyard. The river was no shield. It was the wall of a pen. The bridge was no choke point. It was bait. He knew the Hungarians thought him too proud to divide his force in front of a larger army. He knew they would never believe he would ford a cold river in the black of night. Their certainty was the best weapon he owned. While they slept, he moved. His nephew Batu took a force loud and open against the bridge to fix every Hungarian eye on it. Then Subutai took 30,000 men south in the dark, to a place where the Sajo ran wide and shallow, and set them building a pontoon crossing, board by board. Silently, the heart of the Mongol army slipped across the river and began to curl north, coming up behind the sleeping camp. There was one warning. A Rus deserter slipped into the Hungarian camp during the night and told them Batu's plans. He begged them to strike before dawn while the enemy was split by the river. The message reached the wrong ears, or the right ears too late. No one moved. There is another story that a Hungarian sentry did raise the alarm at the bridge and drove back the first Mongol probe, and that the camp, hearing the crossing beaten off, went back to sleep more certain than before. Dawn on April 11th did not open with trumpets. It opened with a flat, hollow thud. 7 great stone throwers on the east bank began dropping their loads into the middle of the Hungarian camp. Not just stones, fire pots, and, some accounts say, early powder charges brought from China that burst with a crack and a fist of black smoke. The Hungarians woke to burning tents and screaming horses inside a fort so tight they could barely draw a sword. Through the smoke, they saw the assault on the bridge and rushed to meet it. The Templars charged forward to hold the crossing under their master, a knight named Rembald de Vauxhall. They fought with a fury that matched their name, and they died there, cut apart by arrows from the front, and by men who had already crossed the water and struck their flank. Rembald fell with all his Hungarian brothers around him. Béla's brother Cuman fought at the bridge and took wounds that would kill him within weeks. Béla fed his best troops into the crossing, sure it was the door to the whole battle. He was feeding them into a mill. Then the mist lifted. To the south, the sun laid bare a second army, 30,000 riders in silent ranks, stretching from the riverbank to the far horizon. Already across, already behind them. The bridge had never been the battle. It was the lure. The river had never been a shield. It was the far wall of a cage, and the door had just been sealed. The Mongols came on in disciplined waves, moving to the beat of a great war drum and to signal flags that told each unit when to loose and when to fall back. Horse archers rode close, fired, and peeled away, again and again. A wheel of death the knights could not grip. A man who survived wrote that the arrows fell like rain in a storm, and the sky went dark with them. And the knights, forged for one crushing charge, found nothing to charge into, only a storm that would not close, killing them from 20 paces, patient as a slaughterman bleeding cattle. The lines came apart. Then Subutai did the cruelest thing of all. He ordered his men to open a narrow gap in the ring. A corridor running west, away from the river, past a stretch of marsh toward the swamps of the Tisa. To the trapped men, it looked like the hand of God, a way out. They threw down shields and poured into it by the thousands, a screaming flood with one thought left: live. The gap was no mercy. It was the last hinge of the trap. It turned an army into a mob, stretched thin across open ground, easy to run down. Some of the running men hit the marsh in their heavy mail and sank into it. Others threw off their armor as they ran, dropping helmets and breastplates in the mud, unmaking themselves as knights so they could die as fugitives. Once they were strung out and blind with panic, Subutai loosed his light cavalry. Men born in the saddle, bows in hand, and no bottom to their patience. For 2 days they did not fight. They hunted. They rode down knights whose horses had foundered. They speared men who dropped from exhaustion. They tracked survivors into villages and burned the villages with the people still inside. The trail ran nearly 100 miles toward Pest. A Master Roger, an Italian cleric who lived through the invasion and later wrote it all down in a work called The Sorrowful Lament, said the road was so thick with corpses that a rider could follow the army's path by the dead alone, like following a trail of stones. He counted among them the Archbishop of Esztergom, the Archbishop of Kalocsa, 2 more bishops, and the great lords of the realm. The chancellor died with the royal seal still on him, so completely that when the Mongols later wanted to keep the countryside from fleeing, they used it to forge letters in the king's name, telling the peasants to stay on their land. In 48 hours, the army of Hungary stopped existing. As many as 60,000 may have died on the field and along the road. The road to Buda lay open, and there was no one left to stand on it. For everyone who believes history should be told without the varnish and without the comforting lies, there's a place for you here. We've built an inner circle for the most committed viewers of this channel, a community called The Lineage. It's more than a membership. It's an alliance. When you join, you become part of the group that funds these deep digs into the darkest corners of the past. And you make sure these stories are made with the honesty they deserve. If you feel that pull toward the truth, as it really was, tap the Join button below. Join the ranks. Your support keeps the forge burning, and it opens the door to exclusive content and a direct line into our work. Become part of the story. Béla was not on the field when his army died. He was miles off, and when the survivors reached him with the news, he did the only thing left. He ran. His flight became a month-long ordeal across a kingdom coming apart beneath his feet. A Mongol column under a general named Khadan had one order: take the king. This was never just a military aim. It was ritual. Capturing the enemy king proved the reach of the great Khan, proved that no crown, no anointing, no god could stand against him. The message was plain. There is no distance you can put between us. There is no place you can hide. Béla rode west, changing direction by the hour, sleeping in the wet cold of the forests, his party shrinking as men slipped away or were speared on the road. He watched his own cities burn on the skyline. He rode past fields sown with his dead subjects. Master Roger, hiding in the woods himself before he was taken as a slave, wrote that the Mongols spared the harvest and let the peasants bring it in, not from mercy, but so there would be grain to feed the horde through winter. They wanted the land alive just long enough to strip it. Khadan's scouts were everywhere, always a day behind, sometimes an hour. They chased Béla to Pest and sacked it, killing everyone who had sheltered inside. They chased him over the Danube on the winter ice. They chased him into Austria, where Duke Frederick II, the same duke men called the Quarrelsome, betrayed him, stole the royal treasury, and held him for ransom. Béla signed away 3 border counties to buy his freedom, walked out the gate, and found the Mongols waiting. South again, into Croatia, through the stone passes of the Dalmatian mountains. A king with a mark painted on his back, riding through ash. His wife, Maria, rode with him. So did the coffins of 2 of his children, carried on the run because there had been no safe ground to bury them. At last, he reached the Adriatic. He took shelter first at Split, but the harbor there was open and the townsmen wary, so he moved down the coast to the walled town of Trogir, on a small island tied to the shore by a single low causeway. The town was old Roman stone, its harbor smelling of salt and tar, gulls turning over the masts. Béla sent his family onto a ship in the bay and told them to raise anchor the moment the Mongols reached the water. Across the strait, on the hills, he could see them. Khadan's riders, their fires burning through the night, patient, in no hurry at all. He had run to the edge of the world. Behind him, the sea. In front of him, the men who had followed him across an entire continent, riding down to the shallows at low tide, testing the causeway, waiting for the water to fall low enough to cross. The Mongol tide swallowed Hungary. Then it hit Esztergom, and it stopped. Esztergom was the crown of the kingdom, the seat of the primate, a city of palaces and a cathedral on the hill above the Danube, thick with gold and relics, where the kings of Hungary had been anointed since St. Stephen took the crown in the year 1000. Khadan's division came off the hunt for Béla late in the winter and crossed the frozen river on the ice, dragging the siege train over the same water that had drowned merchants a season before. They expected the usual work: They set up the engines that had cracked Kiev open, like an egg. Master Roger, an Italian cleric who lived through the invasion and wrote it down in his sorrowful lament, records that the townsfolk of the lower city set fire to their own suburbs and burned their goods, their cloth, their horses, rather than leave them for the enemy. Smoke stood over the river for days. Then the people pulled back behind the walls and waited. The Mongols set the throwers, judged the range, and let fly. Nothing happened. The stones came apart against the walls. Great blocks that had powdered mud brick in the east now shattered and slid off granite, laid course on course by men who knew exactly what they were building against. The Mongols stood in the cold and watched their weapons fail. This was a war they had never fought. The cities of the Rus and of Persia were huge, but they were timber and sun-dried brick. Fire took them. Steady bombardment took them apart, wall by wall. A European castle was another animal. Meters of stone, towers set so each could rake the ground before the next. Gates banded in iron. The Mongol engineers were the best in the world, and they had walked into a technology built for one purpose only: to outlast a siege. Day after day, they hurled death at the hill. Day after day, the wall said nothing. They took the lower town in the end. Roger records that the people there had buried their gold and silver to keep it, and when the Mongols found it, they killed everyone who might know where more lay: merchants, noblewomen. 300 of the highest-born ladies among them, brought out and beheaded in the open square, dressed as if for a feast. But the citadel above held. Behind those walls there were no shaking townsmen. The defense was led by a Spanish knight named Simeon, a master with the crossbow, and it was stiffened by the professionals of the military orders. Templars, Hospitallers, not the polished heroes of song, men shaped by a century of siege at Acre and Ascalon, who had stood on both sides of a wall and knew the arithmetic of a siege better than anyone alive. A siege is not won by courage. It is won by whoever runs out of bread and will last. They rationed with a cold hand. They set watches like clockwork. From the battlements, their crossbowmen worked the ground below. A steady bleed. The crossbow was slow to wind. A man braced it against his foot with an iron stirrup and hauled the string back with a hook on his belt, one bolt at a time. But that bolt drove through the lamellar plate of a Mongol horseman at 100 paces, and there were hundreds of shooters along the wall. The strip of open earth outside the gate became a place men did not walk twice. The Mongols tried everything they knew. They raised siege towers of green timber. The garrison came out in the dark, poured pitch, and burned them down to the frame. They set 30 engines against the wall at once and drove captives forward under the lash to fill the ditch with earth-filled sacks. The defenders shot the men filling it and left the sacks lying on the dead. They set sappers to dig beneath the foundation. The defenders dug down to meet them and killed them underground, in tunnels too tight to swing a blade, by touch and by torchlight. The same story played out at Székesfehérvár, the city where Hungary's kings were crowned and buried. The spring thaw had turned the marshes around it into a sea of black mud. The Mongol ponies could not move through it. The throwers sank to the axle. The city held. And at the abbey fortress of Pannonhalma, on its hill above the plain, the monks of St. Martin's held their walls through the whole storm and never fell. Trogir on its rock held. So did the islands off the coast, crowded to the shoreline with people who had rowed out to die on stone rather than on the plain. More than a dozen strongholds refused the horde, and everyone that refused was a lesson written in the enemy's own dead. For the first time, the horde had been stopped, not by an army in the field, by ugly towers of stone and the men who refused to leave them. And momentum, the thing the whole conquest ran on, started to leak away. Stone was only half of it. The other half was hidden in the marrow of how the Mongols made war. Their army was not iron and timber. It was a living thing, a herd, and it ran on one fuel: grass. Each warrior led a string of horses, 5 or more. Not the tall war horses of the West. Small, tough steppe ponies that could feed themselves by grazing as they went, dig through snow with their hooves for the dead grass beneath, and carry a man 80 miles in a day when they had to. That was the secret of Mongol speed. No slow baggage trains of fodder. The army was its own moving pasture. 60,000 men might drag 300,000 horses behind them. Carpathian, who traveled among them, wrote that a Mongol would not ride the same horse 2 days running, so the beasts stayed fresh, and the man never wore one out. He wrote, too, that the animals dug for their own food in the snow. Since the Mongols carried none, it was their greatest strength. In the winter of 1241, it turned into the thing that killed them. They had done their work too well. Racing across Hungary, they had burned the fields, killed the herds, wiped out the villages. They had turned the Great Plain, the Alfeld, one of the richest grasslands in Europe, the very ground that had drawn the Magyars there 300 years before, into a black waste. They meant to break the people and starve any army that tried to rise against them. Instead, they had eaten the ground out from under their own horses. Then the snow came. The winter of 1241 into 1242 dropped hard. The cold went far below freezing and locked the Danube into a road of ice. The same ice Khadan had used to cross to Esztergom now became a trap for a horse-borne army, with no forage on either bank. Snow lay thick over the dead grass, and there was nothing beneath it. The famous ponies began to die, first in their thousands, then their tens of thousands. Ribs pushed through winter coats. They gnawed bark from the trees and cropped the last rotten thatch off ruined roofs. They lay down in the snow and did not rise. Men ate the ones that fell, and when those ran out, they ate worse. The finest cavalry the world had seen was being ground into the earth. Without horses, a Mongol was just a man on foot in a country that hated him. The whole system, every tactic built on the speed of the mounted archer, came apart. They were stuck in a frozen desert they had made themselves. Dysentery and typhus moved through the camps, spread by the filth of men and dying animals packed together against the cold. Hunger thinned the ranks. Subutai, who had beaten every clever enemy alive, now faced one he could not outflank or frighten. He was fighting starvation. He was losing to a dead landscape. There was another crack in the wall, and it ran back 1,000 miles to the capital. The princes with the army did not love one another. Batu, grandson of Genghis through the eldest line, and Guyuk, son of the great Khan Ogedei, had quarreled openly at a victory feast during the Rus campaign. Guyuk had mocked Batu, called him an old woman with a quiver, and swore he would beat him about the head if he kept giving himself airs. A prince named Buri had joined the insults. Ogedei heard of it and sent his own son home in disgrace. But the bad blood never healed. The men holding the Western Front were watching the East as hard as they watched Hungary, each measuring what a throne back home was worth against a war that had gone sour. Far to the south, the hunt for Béla hit its own wall. Khadan had chased the king onto the Dalmatian coast, into the land men now call Croatia. This was not the open steppe the Mongols loved. It was a maze of limestone mountains, bare white karst that cut a horse's legs, narrow gorges, passes barely wide enough for a single rider. The killing plains were gone. Here the land itself was the enemy. A Mongol column strung out single file through a gorge was no longer an army. It was a target. The Croats knew every rock. They would let the vanguard ride in, then roll boulders down to seal the pass at both ends. Trapped in the stone throat, the riders could do nothing but die. From the cliffs above, archers and crossbowmen picked them off at leisure. The mountain herdsmen who lived by their goats fought the same way, appearing on a ridgeline and gone before an arrow could answer. The hunters were the hunted now. Foraging parties that rode up into the hills simply did not come back. The wolves of the steppe had become meat in the mountains, bled by an enemy they never saw. Khadan pushed all the way to Split, then down the coast to Trogir, where Béla was walled up on his island. He could see the prize, he could not touch it. The Mongols had no ships. They sent a captured Hungarian to the water's edge to shout across that they wanted only the king, and the town would be spared if it gave him up. Trogir did not answer. They tried to force the narrow channel at low tide and were driven back by crossbow bolts from the walls. Khadan cut inland, sacked the suburbs of Split and the fortress of Klis, then turned south and burned his way out through Kotor, Svach, and Drivast on the road home. But the king sat a stone's throw from his hand, out of reach. The great chase, the ritual meant to prove the Khan's power over every crown on earth, died there, in the shallows, in failure. Then, in the spring of 1242, a rider came out of the east. He had crossed thousands of miles of Asia with news that would bend the course of history. The great Khan Ogadei was dead. He had drunk himself into the grave in his palace at Karakorum on the 11th of December, 1241. He had been warned for years to leave the wine alone. When his brother Chagatai set a man to count his cups each day, Ogadei thanked him, kept the man on, and simply had a wider bowl made so that fewer cups would carry more wine. Mongol law was plain. Every prince of the blood, every heir of Genghis, had to ride home to the Kurultai, the great assembly on the steppe, to elect the next great Khan. Batu, who commanded the whole Western war and had a claim of his own to guard, could not afford to be a continent away while Guyuk's faction moved on the throne. The regency had already fallen to Ogadei's widow, Toragena, who was pulling every string she owned to seat her son. The princes with the army had no choice. They turned around. For centuries, this one death has been called the miracle that saved Christendom. Pure luck. A drunkard's heart giving out at just the right hour. But that is too easy. It ignores what was actually happening on the ground. For the readers among you who want to hold this history in your hands, we've put together something. Tap the View Products button on your screen right now. You'll find the book that anchored this whole investigation. A hard, honest account that strips the past down to the bone. If you want to feel the weight of this age, you need it on your shelf. This was our main source, but we didn't stop at the book. We've gathered other pieces, dark keepsakes built to tie you to this story in a way no video can. We won't spoil what they are. Open the shop shelf on your screen. Look through the relics we found. Pick the ones that speak to the historian in you and bring a shard of this world home. Do it now, while the story runs on. Subutai was a pragmatist before he was anything else. Ogadai's death was not a blow to him, it was a gift. An honorable reason to do the thing he already knew he had to do. Leave. His campaign had failed at its main task. Béla was still breathing, still free. His army was gutted, its speed dead in the snow with the horses. Stone walls had fought him to a standstill at Esztergom, Székesfehérvár, and Pannonhalma. The mountains of Dalmatia had made his tactics worthless. The horde was never built to hold ground. It was a wave. It lived on speed, terror, and momentum, and in Hungary, all three were gone. The war could no longer be won the way the Mongols understood winning. To stay was to feed his whole army into a slow, grinding fight it was not made for. So they went. It was not a parade. It was the retreat of a wounded animal. They gathered the last of their captives, roped them together, and drove them along, killing those who could not keep the pace. Roger, dragged with a column as a slave, waited for a night when the guards were drunk, slipped into a forest near a village, and hid under fallen leaves and branches for 2 days while the riders passed above him. He heard their voices, their horses, the crying of other captives, and did not move. When the sound of hooves finally died, he crawled out into a land of the dead. The horde limped east through Bulgaria and Serbia, still killing as it crossed, but it was leaving. The storm rolled off the map. Europe lived, not because of a great captain or a decisive battle, but because of granite, starvation, a mountain range, and a dead man's wine. The engine of the apocalypse had simply run out of fuel. Béla stepped off his island into the salt wind and started for home. What he found on the road broke something in him. Roger, walking the same country, wrote of villages where the only sound was the barking of masterless dogs, of fields where the grain had grown up wild around the bones of the men who had sown it and never returned to reap it. He wrote of survivors so starved they dug corpses from the ground to eat, and of a mother and her children who did the same until hunger turned them on one another. He walked 8 days through one region and saw no standing house, no smoke, no living face. Whole counties held no soul at all. Half the kingdom's people, by some counts more, and 9 in 10 in the lands east of the Danube, were dead or gone in ropes to the east. Wolves had grown so bold they came into what was left of the towns in daylight and took children from the doorways. He was not going back to a kingdom. He was going back to a graveyard the size of a country. The treasury was empty, stolen at the Austrian border by a duke who called himself an ally. The army was a memory. The great lords who had refused him at the Sajo were dead in the marsh or hiding in the hills, and the ones still living would fight him over every acre he tried to reclaim. And in the ash, the survivors were already whispering the thing every broken people whispers when the enemy pulls back instead of dying. He heard it in Trogir the day the campfires across the strait went cold. He would hear it every day of the years to come, in every ruined town he tried to raise from the ground. The horde had not been beaten. It had only stepped back to breathe. It would return, and when it did, there would be no kind winter waiting to save them a second time. When Béla IV stepped off the boat in 1242, he did not walk back into a kingdom. He walked into a body. The land lay in shock under a wide, empty sky. He rode for days and passed no one. He crossed fields where the wheat stood tall and full, not from a good harvest, but because there was no one left to cut it. In the furrows, tangled in the roots, lay the bones of the men who had planted it. Villages were black stains on the ground, huts burned to their sills, the only movement a shutter knocking in the wind. The silence carried the worst of it. The quiet of a country where half the people were gone. Of perhaps 2 million living in Hungary before the storm, close to 1 million were dead or dragged east in ropes. In the lands beyond the Danube, whole counties held no living soul. Wolves came into the ruined towns in daylight and took what they found. Master Roger, who had crawled out of a Mongol slave column into that same country, wrote that a man could walk for days and hear nothing but the wind and the dogs. This was not the wreckage of a war. It was the wreckage of an extinction. The ride through that dead country burned the old king out of him. The frightened man who had run from swamp to sea was gone. The feudal lord who trusted his knights and his god was gone too. What came out the other side was cold, hard, and fixed on one idea. He looked at the bones in the grain and felt no grief. He felt a clarity close to madness. He had seen the thing itself now, and he had learned how it spoke. Speed, hunger, total war. The Mongols were not an army. They were weather. And you do not fight a wildfire with a blade. You starve it. You cut a firebreak and rob it of fuel. So Béla gave the rest of his life to one task: turn the whole kingdom into a firebreak of stone. Build a country the Horde could not swallow. Build the Mongols a grave. There was one lesson he never let himself forget. When the Horde first came, Hungary had barely 10 strongpoints of real stone. The wooden forts had burned like kindling, but Esztergom's citadel had held. Székesfehérvár in its marsh had held. The abbey rock of Pannonhalma had held. Trógir had held. Béla had watched from his island which walls the Mongols could break and which ones broke them. He built his whole future on that ledger. His first move was a revolution dressed as a decree. He called in the barons who had lived, the ones who had hidden in wooden forts or run with him to the coast. He set a new law before them, one that cut into the root of the feudal bargain. From this day, land was no longer held by birth alone. It was held on a condition. Every lord must raise a stone castle on his ground, not a fortified house, not a palisade on a mound, a fortress of granite and mortar, set on high ground, built to the newest design. Refuse it, or fail to pay for it, and the land and the title passed to a man who would. The message had no soft edge. Build a wall, or cease to exist. The nobility raged. Never had a king reached so far into their rights. Béla did not care about their rights. He had seen their rights lying headless in the mud at Mohi. He broke his own crown monopoly on castle building and pushed towns, bishops, and rich commoners to raise their own walls. He raised Buda's fortress on its hill above the Danube and moved the seat of power there, onto rock the ice crossings could not reach. He rebuilt Esztergom in stone. He handed the abbot of Pannonhalma new lands for having held through the storm. He sent word into the German and Italian lands, offering land and freedom from taxes to masons, engineers, and stonecutters, and they came by the thousand. He needed their hands and their knowledge. The design they brought was the high donjon and the concentric wall. A tower a man could hold with 20 crossbows, while a horde broke against it below. He drew whole villages of German settlers east into Transylvania, gave them charters and free markets, and set them behind walls that would one day be called the Seven Fortresses. Every settler was a soldier. The crown did not have to pay in peacetime and could not do without in war. He was not rebuilding a kingdom. He was re-engineering one from the bedrock up. He planned a defense with depth, a belt of stone along the eastern edge, castles set to command every pass, every ford, every road, each within sight of the next, so a fire signal from one could reach the next before a rider could cover the ground. The next invader would not meet an army in a field. It would meet a country turned into a maze, built to slow it, bleed it, and starve it. By the time the work was finished, more than 100 new stone castles stood where there had been almost none. Stone was one half of the weapon. The warrior was the other. Béla rebuilt his army with the same cold hand. The age of the glorious charge was over. It had died at Mohi, shot to rags inside a burning wagon fort. His new army would be another animal. And here he did a bitter thing. He invited the Cumans back, the same steppe people whose presence had given the Mongols their excuse in 1241, the same people a pest mob had dragged from their lodgings and butchered on the eve of the battle, throwing their king Khotani's head into the street. That killing had driven 40,000 horse archers out of the kingdom in the week he needed them most. Now he gave them the empty grasslands between the Danube and the Tisa, and folded their riders into his forces. To seal it, he married his own son and heir, the future Ladislaus, to a Cuman chieftain's daughter named Elizabeth. He needed men who understood the enemy's way of war. The Cumans were his answer to the horse archer, the one soldier who could meet a Mongol on his own terms and win. It was a bargain that would fracture his own court, but Béla had stopped caring what the court thought when he counted the dead at Mohi. For his own knights, he threw out the old book. He poured money into the crossbow and into heavy plate. The knight was no longer a battering ram for the open plain. He became a killing post anchored to a wall, sheathed in steel that turned an arrow, armed with a bow that punched through a Mongol's lamellar plate at 100 paces. His work was not to charge for glory. It was to hold the battlements, guard the choke points, and bleed anything that came in range. He built pontoon guards along the great rivers, so no enemy could steal a crossing at night the way Subutai had stolen the Sajo. He militarized the whole society. He handed towns their liberties in exchange for trained armed footmen and the promise to keep their walls in repair. He reshaped the law to raise a larger, harder, more disciplined force. He reached beyond his borders too, marrying his daughters into the ruling houses of Poland, Bohemia, and the Rus, to build a ring of allies who would see the next horde coming and answer his call. He even took an unusual step for a Christian king of the age. His own daughter Margaret he gave to God, promised to a convent on an island in the Danube in return for the kingdom's survival. And she lived out her life there in the cold stone of a nunnery that still carries her name. He minted new coin, rebuilt the ruined mints, and reopened the salt roads to Transylvania, because a fortress kingdom without silver in its treasury is only a ruin with taller walls. He was building for a different war, not a war of battles, a war of sieges, ambushes, and empty larders, a war of patience and pain. He spent 40 years at it and did not do it in peace. The Austrian Duke Frederick the Quarrelsome, the same man who had robbed his treasury during the flight, kept clawing at the western border. Béla ground him down until the Duke fell in battle against Hungarian and Cuman forces at the Leitha River in 1246, and his line died with him. When the Bohemian king Ottokar reached for the same lands, Béla fought him too, was beaten badly at Kreuzenbrunn in 1260, and kept building anyway. Then his own son Stephen turned on him. The heir Béla had armed and married to the Cumans, rose in open war against his father, split the kingdom in two, and forced the old king to divide the realm along the Danube in a treaty signed under the eyes of both their armies. Béla built his fortress country with one hand and held it against his own blood with the other. He died on the 3rd of May, 1270, in the Dominican house on Margaret's Island, an old man who had spent his last years afraid the horde would return before the walls were done. He never saw whether the trap would hold. He was buried at Esztergom, in the church of the friars he had favored, in a kingdom that no longer looked anything like the one he had inherited. In 1285, the Mongols came to test it. The second invasion was led by Nogai, one of the most powerful men in the empire, a one-eyed kingmaker who ruled his own realm on the western steppe and made and unmade khans as he pleased. Beside him rode Talabuga, a prince of the ruling line who nominally led the campaign. They crossed the Carpathians in the dead of winter at the head of a great host, and expected 1241 all over again. Open country, frightened peasants, wooden forts to burn, a feudal army foolish enough to meet them in the field, the rich grass of the plain to feed their horses, a quick campaign of plunder and slaughter. They found none of it. Where there had been open plain, there was now a labyrinth. Every point they had to pass wore a stone crown. Every mountain gap watched them through the arrow slits of a tower. The Hungarians refused the one thing the Mongols wanted, a decisive battle. King Ladislaus IV, called the Cuman for his love of his mother's people, ran Béla's plan exactly as it was drawn. His army did not gather to be destroyed. It dissolved into the castles, manned the walls, and dared the horde to fight 1,000 sieges at once. Nogai could not ride past the castles. They sat on his supply lines and his roads. Leaving them at his back was suicide. Taking them meant throwing men against granite under a rain of crossbow bolts, day after day, for nothing. Pest had walls now. The German towns of Transylvania sat behind stone and would not open their gates. The horde stormed a few outlying places and broke against the rest. And the land itself had turned on him. Just as Béla had meant, the country ahead of the horde was stripped bare. The people had pulled back behind walls. The herds were driven off. The grain was moved or burned in the barns before the riders could reach it. The Mongols, who lived off the land, found the land empty. Their foragers had to ride farther and farther out, deep into hills that hated them. Out there, the second jaw of the trap closed. The Cuman archers, riding now for the Hungarian crown, began to hunt the hunters. They knew the ground. They knew every trick the Mongols knew. They shadowed a foraging party for days and struck when it was strung out and blind. An arrow storm out of a tree line. A sudden charge into a broken column. The Mongols were being stalked and killed by men who fought exactly as they did. The Zekali, the mountain guardsmen of the eastern frontier, and the Vlach herdsmen of the high country did the same in their forests, cutting off stragglers and vanishing before an answer could come. Then the winter tightened. Nogai's horses, with no pasture beneath the snow, began to die. The same death that had killed the ponies of 1242. Hunger and cold set in. A thaw turned the passes to running mud and then froze them again to sheets of ice. Disease moved through the crowded camps. The war machine ground to a stop for the second time in the same country for the same reasons. And this time, the men in the towers had planned for every one of them. The end of the second invasion was not a battle. It was a slow coming apart. The horde bled from 1,000 small wounds until Nogai and Talabuga had no choice but to turn for home. But retreat had become its own trap. Now Ladislaus brought his army out of the walls, not to stand and fight in the open, but to hunt the starving columns as they scrambled back toward the passes. The retreat became a slaughter. In the choked mountain gaps of Transylvania, the Hungarians and their Cumans and the Zekali fell on the fleeing Mongols and cut them down in the snow. Talabuga's own column lost its way in the frozen passes, ran out of food, and was cut apart by the mountain men and the weather together. Accounts of the time say he came out with a fraction of what he led in, on foot, his horses dead or eaten, his prince's dignity gone. Nogai fared better and pulled his men out with more order, but even he left the country with nothing to show for the crossing but corpses in the snow. The men who had once called themselves masters of the earth threw down their weapons and their armor, and ran for the borders. hunted every step by the grandsons of the men they had butchered 44 years before. The freed captives they had roped together at the start of the raid turned on their guards in the passes and helped finish them. The chronicles record that so few came home from Talabuga's host that the failure helped bring the man down within a few years, undone in his own step by the one-eyed Nogai, who had ridden beside him. The king who had first been chased to the edge of the sea had won the war. Through a son he barely lived to raise, and a plan he did not live to see tested. Béla was in his grave 15 years by then, but the victory was written in every stone he had commanded into being, and in every tactic of the army that ran the horde to ruin. He had learned the one lesson Mohi had to teach, that against a power built to erase you, endurance is not enough. You have to become its mirror. You have to be willing to turn your whole nation into a weapon and match the enemy's ruthlessness with your own. He had taken the broken pieces of his kingdom and forged them into a wall, a trap, a tomb. The chronicles that once mocked him as the king who lost everything now named him the second founder of the state. He had built the Mongols their European grave, one bloody stone at a time, and the horde that had laughed on the mud flats of the Sajo never took Hungary again. Thank you for staying to the very end. If you believe the darkest stories from history deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel, tap like on this video, and send it to one person who needs to hear it. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. And your journey doesn't end here. The video now appearing on your screen is the next descent into the past. Tap it. Keep going. We'll be waiting for you there.